Hello, hello. Welcome to today's class. We're going to continue on doing some learning about some stuff with our capstone sandbox application. So the basic agenda that we're looking at is working with some CRUD forms with internal entities that we'll do in the sandbox. Then what I'm going to ask you to do is work with the west wind to do some practice homework. And as preparation for the next topic that we're going to get into, I want you to check out the 12-minute video, which is going to how to create your first wireframe. So you can go and check that out. That's one of the videos for the playlist that I've got. And I want you to check out that 12, 13-minute video as part of your homework. So, with that being said, let's take a little bit of a look at what I want us to cover for the sandbox project. You can go ahead and get that started from your workbook. We're going to do some CRUD forms for our capstone students. And here's some of the big picture overview of what we're going to be looking at doing. Remember that when we created our entities, reverse engineering from the database, we wound up making all of those internal to our backend class library. As such, we can't use those entity classes in our front end. We're being blocked from working with it that way. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to create a separate class to act as a model of our student information. And because this is basically just working as a data transfer object, just to hold some information to move it to the back end, I'm going to make it really simple. I'll make it a record with the student having an ID, a first name, and a last name. And the methods that we're going to need on our back end to do our CRUD will be ones that use this student class. And I'll be putting this under the backend models folder. So our business logic layer class will have the add, update, and delete methods working with that backend information. The update and the delete will have some additional pieces of information regarding the student ID. So that's the essence of what we're going to go and work with on the back end to get things set up for CRUD. Beyond that, in terms of the code that's inside of those methods, you should already know that from CPSC 1517. We're going to need to go, and for the adding, we're going to need to add a new student onto the database context object. For the update, we'll need to be basically finding that student or getting that particular entry and then indicating that something's being modified with it. We'll do a little bit of validation there as well to ensure that there's no duplicates with that, because the ID for a student, which is the school ID, winds up becoming an alternate key inside of our database and another way that we can refer to the student. And then from the delete, again, we'll just be finding that particular student and removing them. So that's the back end side of things. Once we have that in place, we'll be able to go ahead and move on to the front end. And this is where we're going to see some of the things that are unique to doing our Razor pages. So again, for those of you who have done the ASPX pages in 1517, you're going to see just a few differences on how it's done. I'll show you how we can use a data list with an input tag to help a little bit of our lookup, and how we'll have get get opportunities for doing editing of or looking up of a given student using a routing parameter on a page directive with a bind property on a property inside of our page model. And then for handling the post actions, which basically is the add, update, and delete, we'll have individual page handlers for that. And with the post, we're going to use something called the post redirect get pattern. So this is a pattern that we should be using regularly for our major post processing that occurs for a page when we're turning around and actually hitting the back end and doing some changes to the database. We'll also take a quick little look at validation and how we can use some jQuery validation to improve our form. So concept-wise, this is still all of the CRUD functionality that you learned in 15-17. We're going to apply it now to our 2018 application. Let's go ahead and start up the sandbox. And I'll move my code off to the side. And I'll clean up some of my items there. Let's focus now on our back-end portion of our application. By the way, give me a little bit of a thumbs up if you're going to be coding along with me. In today's live class. And I'm going to right click on models. I'm going to add a class that I will call student. But I'm going to change it from being a class to making it a public record of a student, where I have as a string the ID of that particular student, and another one for the first name, and another one for the last name. So this particular backend model that we're going to use, which is a public class, is going to be the public representation of this student class from my entities. So here's my backend entities on the bottom with that internal partial class student. It has a constructor to deal with the navigation property of the team assignments. It's got the attributes for which property is corresponding to the primary key on the database, student ID, what is going to be the school ID, the first name, and the last name. And so essentially what we're winding up doing is we're just modeling these three pieces of information in our public student class in our backend models. That's essentially what we're going and modeling. This one here that is the primary key, we're going to sort of treat that as a little separate piece of information because it's only needed in the cases of doing an update and a delete. We don't need to provide a student ID when we're going and adding in a new student. Let me go ahead and do a quick little screen capture of that so that you can see that bit of a comparison amongst those. We're going to want to have a business logic layer service for our system. I'm just going to call that the capstone services or capstone service. So let's go and set up for our BLL a class that we'll call capstone service. We'll make this a public class capstone service. And we'll do a similar thing that we did with the about service in that we're going to have a dependency upon our capstone context. So I'll create a private read-only capstone context. This is from my backend DAL. Give this underscore context. And then I'll create my constructor for dependency injection. Except I'm going to have to make this an internal class. And I'll have to set up my dependency injection for this. So let me go and open up my startup extension. I'll just dock this at the bottom of that one. Excuse me while I'm messing around with my classes. There we go. And so in my startup extensions, I'm going to want to add a transient one that goes and returns my capstone context. So I'll do similar sort of a thing. I'll say services dot add transient for my capstone service, and I'll create my factory such that it uses the following to produce my service. Lowercase s, and then the IntelliSense will work. Get required service for the capstone context and return a new capstone service with that context. There we go. And a semicolon. So that is the whole process that we're going to use to get everything set up. Let's expand this a little bit. Get the full width. There we go. Thumbs up when you have these 3 files created or edited. So the startup extension .cs file was one that we had done before, just simply adding to its add backend dependencies method. And the other 2 are new ones. I'm also curious, I had mentioned in a previous class about getting a copy of Head First Design Patterns, and I guess that book is in its 2nd edition, so it looks a little bit of a different cover than the one that I showed you. Give a heart if you have already bought your copy of Head First Design Patterns. And sure, I can go ahead and expand the startup extension a little bit. The student.cs is probably one that you've already got coded. The capstone service is pretty much just a simple class right now. Let's look at the full body of our backend dependencies. It's recommended if you want to if you want to get better at your job and learn more about some good programming. It's recommended. You don't have to worry about it until you maybe graduate or something like that. So if money's really tight, you can just put it on the back burner for now, or better yet, put it on a wish list. Christmas is coming up. See if you can get somebody in your family to buy it for you. Yeah, the Head First series is a really good series of books. That's pretty nice. It's far more engaging, far more kind of interactive, and it isn't very boring. So yeah, put it on your Christmas wish list. Start contacting your friends and family and let them know that you are a poor student in need. Okay, I've got about 12 thumbs up for having the files created. And I threw a screenshot of those ones up there. So I'm going to now just focus in on that capstone service itself. And I'm going to go and want to add in the actual CRUD methods. I'm going to just throw a little pound region for the constructor and dependencies. Pound and region. So I can go and collapse that. Let's see. Oh, that's right. I just wanted to collapse that portion. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to now have a bunch of methods that are going to provide um, CRUD behavior for student information. And so I'm going to create a public int add backend.models.student. That I'll just temporarily have a throw new not implemented exception. So it compiles. And then I'll do my other ones as well. Public void update, where I'll pass in an int student ID and a backend models student. So the big thing here is I want to provide some validation of no duplicates. I'm going to want to probably do that inside of that add as well. And then I'll have a public void delete. And I'll go and I'll take the student that I want to delete. In actuality, I could probably go and just have it with that student ID itself. In fact, I'll go ahead and I'll do it like that. And maybe I will give these a little bit better names, like delete student and update student and add student. Just to avoid any future possible confusion if I wind up needing to have other CRUD functionality going on. Give me a thumbs up. You have these method stubs coded. A method stub is just a term for a method where you haven't figured out what the body of the method is going to be yet. So you've created the method with its return type, with its parameter list, but you haven't put anything meaningful inside the middle of the method. Probably in those cases, you should have throw new not implemented exceptions so that you remember to come back to it and complete it if you're moving on to other things. And I'm curious, does anybody remember how we would add a student to our database? Given what we've called our database context object, what line of code would we probably want to have? What method on the context would we want to code to add a new student? Anybody remember? As everybody madly goes referencing their stuff. Yeah, it's a bit of a while ago. Hey, man, a lot of you guys are going and saying, that was like, what was that? 6 months ago, half a year ago? Yeah, something to do with context. Context dot something or other. Context dot update? Nah, not quite. Save? Oh, that's true. We're going to need to save changes. That's very true. At some point for these, we're going to need to have an underscore context dot save changes. By the way, this is where the transaction processing occurs. So if you've seen the thing about, we're going to be covering online transaction processing in this, having it work as a transaction is just a matter of saying underscore context save changes. Yeah, good thing we have the internet. And by the way, dig out your notes for 15, 17. You never know when they'll be coming in handy. Well, the big thing is that we go and we say underscore context dot students dot add. And what do we want to put in there? We want to put in there some new data, right? What's the data type that new data would have to be? What kind of a thing is it? Has to be a student. Specifically, we would say, I'll say var. Actually, I'll do it as student. I'll do a control dot. Notice we have the student class defined in two different namespaces. The student I want is in the backend entities. So I'll use that using statement. So this student, which is a backend entity student, not a backend model student, need it to be matching up. So the student new data needs to be instantiated with the information that we got from the student object that came in. So we've got a school ID, which is equal to the student ID. We've got a first name, which is equal to the student first name. And we've got a last name that's equal to the student last name. So we're transferring the data. All we're basically doing here is transferring the data from our public model to the internal entity type. By the way, we can get rid of this throw statement here. But we do need to do something after all that is done. We need to return the new data, student ID, to get it to return the integer value. So that is how we would go and add our student. Let's take a moment and look at the stuff that's in our database. In fact, let's go ahead and use LinkPad. Go ahead, use the capstone service. I want to just take a little look at the students that are there. So there we go, students. They've got their IDs, their numbers that increment. They got their school ID, which, although it's a number here, remember the data type for that is still a string because it's an n-varchar. And so there we're going to want to have that school ID to be treated as though it's unique. So imagine that we're going to go and add in a student where the ID is 2020 or sorry 2021 1018, something like that. So imagine if I'm looking for students where there are any student such that their school ID matches the 2021 1018, let's say. We could ask that any question because it's going to go and return a Boolean. The any uses a predicate function that compares a given student to something. So that's the parameter item. Person is a student object. And it returns a Boolean. And here I've got my Boolean expression, person.schoolid equals something there. And then that's going to give me a true or a false. If any of those students have a situation that matches that, then bang, I've got a duplicate. So let's go and take a little bit of a screenshot of that. I'll go ahead and do it like that. So with that bit of information, let's go ahead and do that. Let's do our validation of no duplicates. If underscore context students has any person such that the person's school ID matches the incoming student ID, then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to throw a new argument exception, argument out of range exception. Let's call that. And which version of this will we use? We'll use the one that has the name of the parameter and the message. So name of student ID and the message that we'll wind up putting in there is a student already exists with that school ID. So there's going to be our validation. Okay, so give me a thumbs up when you've coded this. I'm going to throw in a couple little items inside the update student. I'm just going to have this as a as something that still has to be completed. So I'll throw a new not implemented exception, name of update student. You finish this. And I'll do a similar thing down here. Throw new not implemented exception. It's the name of my delete student method to do finish this. So a couple little to-do items. And like I said, give me a thumbs up when you're done coding. Here's an interesting thing about everything that you're taking in your programming classes. Everything that you learn is cumulative. There are things that I encounter that are new to me after decades of programming experience. I still run into things that are new to me, but oftentimes what helps me understand what's going on or better appreciate these new things is something else that I learned a long time ago in programming. So it's worthwhile to keep some of these notes and keep some of these things. You guys are going to be going into capstone yourself soon, hopefully next term, and you're going to find yourself going and saying, "Oh, what was that thing that Dan talked about?" Yeah, or that example that we did in class. It was something about capstone. It was something about Westwind or whatever. And you're going to want to find that, and you should be keeping notes. That's why I'm getting you set up with your workbook. Okay, let's go and switch our focus from the back end to the front end of our application. We're going to want to go and look at some of the things that are new in regard to Razor pages that you may not have seen before. We've got this pages section, and I'm going to create a little folder inside there that I'll call admin, because it's an administrative function. And I'm going to right click on that admin folder, and I'm going to add a Razor page that I will call manage students, manage capstone students. So that's going to be the name of it, manage capstone students. And I'll just grab the model class, dump it just underneath here. So we'll have all of our code available. And let's see, how shall I do this? I think I'm going to go and want to do a bit of a lookup for a student. So I'm going to use a form, and I will have it be, I'll finish out the method in just a little bit, but I will wind up having a label that I'm going to want to have in this that is going to be for doing lookup by or lookup student. And what I'm going to want to have inside of there is a input. We'll make its type equal to, text for now. And what we'll wind up doing is closing that off, and I'll have a placeholder inside of there that will be partial first or last name. To be the little bit of a clue that we're going to have in there. And then I'm going to make a data list with an ID of existing students. Yeah, that's how I'll start it out. And I think I'm going to wind up putting on this, I think it's a list attribute, existing students. There we go. By the way, give me a thumbs up if you have ever seen the input element used with a data list element. Curious if anybody's ever seen that. Yeah, I thought I had showed one, but I couldn't remember. Because I'm kind of doing all this. I'm shooting by the hip in all of this, making it up as I go. And I'm getting old and my memory is blurring, let's say. When I was your age. One of the things that we're going to need inside of our model class, by the way, is we're going to need our capstone service. So let's go and have our constructor and dependencies for this. And I'll have a private read-only capstone service control dot, gives me the using backend.bll, and I'll call this my service. And I'll create a public managed capstone students model with the capstone service, and we'll go ahead and assign that. Have all our dependencies available. Let's see. I'm going to want to get some information out of my service. When I start things up, I'm going to just use a temporary variable right now. I'll just say var all students is equal to underscore service dot list all students, list capstone students, capstone students. I don't have that method yet, so I'm going to want to build that. Well, so let's do that. Let's build that. Control dot. Let's declare a method. And where will I have that method? I'll just put that, I'll do that just before the add student. Do a delete. Doesn't matter where inside the capstone services you have it, but I won't want to have an object so much as a list of my students. So I want to have a list of student name, and I should define what that student name is going to be. So I'll create a class in my models. I will add class student name. So this would be a public class student name. Let me just, maybe I'll just float it over here loosely on the side, because I'm fighting for screen real estate. And what I'll do I want to make this a record, or do I want to make it a class? I think I'll make it a record. I'll make it a public record student name that will have an int student ID, string formal name. So formal name should be in the format of last name, comma, first name. That's what it should be. So list of student name. Actually, that'll be a list of backend models student name. And I'll want to get all of that information. So what I'll do is I will say bar result is equal to context students, select each person such that I create a new backend models student name with a ID being the person student ID, and the formal name being the person last name and the person first name. And I'm going to need to do one extra little thing there. So let me just go and yeah, I'll make this part indented a little bit just to make it a little bit more readable. But I'm going to have to do something about that By the way, I can then turn around and return the result to list. But the student information, I'm going to want to put on I'll take out that semicolon and I'll put on a parameterless constructor on here as well. So I'll make a public student name that simply goes and sends in 0 and null for the information. So that's my parameterless constructor. And I'll shrink this just a little bit so I can get it dropped right over top here. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I've got. So this is my data type, student name. It's a record. You should really Google the C#9 record. This here is a parameterless constructor. So that is my parameterless constructor, and it's called that because there are no parameters in the constructor's signature. Compared to this notion that we see right here in declaring our record, whereas part of our declaration of our record, we wind up having something that's called a greedy constructor. That's what happens in our record class when we define it. We can identify a greedy constructor, and it's called greedy because it identifies all of the parameters for all of the properties inside that data type, inside that class. So I'm throwing a lot of terminology at you, something to be looking at. Because I am in my query of the database, because I am instantiating my student name object, I need to have the parameterless constructor when working with Entity Framework. So Entity Framework expects a parameterless constructor for going and getting the information from the database and being able to properly do the instantiation. So that's why I'm saying that I'm doing a new backend model student name, and I'm setting each of these properties, student ID and formal name, as part of the initializer list. So remember that this part here in the grammar is my initializer list for the student name data type. You can read the grammar. You can look at it and start seeing, okay, this follows the pattern of a constructor. This follows the pattern of an initializer list. This follows the pattern of doing an instantiation of an object, new backend models.studentName. If you can recognize all of those different kinds of patterns that are going on, you'll be able to read the code and make better sense of what's happening. Let me do a quick little print screen of this stuff. And I'll go ahead and I will dock this part as part of this other list right here. So I've got my capstone CSHTML. All students is a list of T. I'll actually go and I will create this as a public list of students' name for my backend models. All students with a get and a set, and then I'll take out this var keyword, and now I've got my get turning around and populating all of the students. So let me go back to my CSHTML and let me put in a little for loop inside of there. So for each var person in model.allStudents, I'm going to want to add in an option tag with a value that is the person's student ID. I believe it's what I called it. And then have the person's formal name be what is displayed there. And that's what I'm going to have for my data list. So get that finished up. We'll come back in about 10 minutes and we'll take a look at how well our page is doing. By the way, don't forget to put in a menu item for us to be able to get to our Manage Capstone Students page. We'll see you guys in about 10 minutes time. Okay, we're back from the break. We got a few questions popping up inside of the chat. Let's go ahead and take a little bit of a look. One of the first questions that we have is, why am I getting this particular error? Inconsistent accessibility, parameter type capstone service is less accessible than the method manage capstone students model dot manage capstone student model capstone service. So it's telling you exactly what's going on in here. This parameter right here is less accessible because this particular class is internal, whereas we've gone and declared that the manage capstone students model was public. So the solution to this is to go and no longer make it public. I do this line. No longer make it public, but rather go ahead and make this thing internal as well. So that's the solution for that particular item. Also, don't forget to get rid of that var item. It's just all students is equal to that list capstone students. And that should be good for that part. Another question. I'm getting this error for some reason. So the backend model student name, it's got a little squiggle underneath there. And we'd have to see there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameters student ID of student name int string. So you need to go and just sort of double check. Let me pull my code up. And on this, you need to make sure that your student name has a parameterless constructor. So make sure you take off the semicolon at the end of that, put that on, and then you're going to have your parameterless constructor that allows you to turn around and return that new item. So give all those a check. When you go and run it, you should see when you go to the capstone students page that if you have a partial first and last name and you start typing in there something like, let's see if there's a Mary. Oh, not a Mary, but there's a tomorrow. How about a Tim? There's one Timothy. How about what's another possible first name? G-A, only one Gary. There's not that many students here. That's part of the problem. All with very unique names. But I bet if we had 100 or so, that'd be pretty good. But you can start typing either any part of the first or last name. See who has an O and an E in their name. And then you can choose that person. You wind up getting the student ID because what's happening in your main here is that your data list has as the value the ID. So that's how we're getting that. Okay, so this is good. We've got the whole ability for being able to do a little bit of a lookup with that. We'll need to add in a button. We'll need to be able to capture the whole aspect that we're looking up that particular student with that particular ID. We'll dive into doing some of that code right now. And let's just take a quick little bit of a look at our CS/HTML, because that's going to be where we're going to work with some interesting stuff in regard to our form. Now we know by default that there's a bit of a question. Did we put anything into the Capstone service class in the admin folder? I think might have missed something there. What we did was in the admin folder, that's where I put the manage Capstone students class, that page, that CS/HTML. That's what I put under the admin folder. The capstone service class itself is in the back end in the business logic layer. Now, one of the things that we know about forms is that when a browser sends a request to the web server as the result of a form that the user is submitting. Yeah, that'll do it for sure. What happens with the form is that it's going to be sending the request to the web server as either a post or a get. Can anybody tell me on the form element what attribute I use to specify the way that I want the form to be submitted? Does anybody remember that? Method. That's right. So on the form tag, there is a method attribute that we can set to a few different things. There's get and there is post. There's another one here called dialogue. I won't get into that one, but the get and the post are the two that we would wind up working with. Can anybody tell me what the characteristic would be if we use a get? And I'll go ahead and I'll put a little button on my form. Type is equal to submit. And I will go and say get student information. But what will happen if I've got a method equal get as far as my input? And I'm going to create a little bit of a property for this. I'll create a public int selected student with a get and a set. Can anybody tell me what's going to happen if I say for my input that I want my input to use an ASP for my selected student? What will happen if it's a get request? That's correct. We're going to have a key value pair on the URL. Let's go and take a little bit of a look at this. So if I come to my capstone students, I look up a student with 30 in there and I get the student information. Look at what has happened. I've got a query string with a name value pair, selected student equal 30. And the problem with that is that it looks a little bit like almost like data leakage. In some ways, I would rather have that 30 be part of the URL. Now, this whole thing, the URL that's being requested, that page that's being requested, that goes through a routing mechanism in Razor Pages for it to be able to go and hit this particular page, the Manage Capstone Student page. What I'm going to do with my CSHTML is I'm going to add onto the page directive, I'm going to add some routing information. And I'm going to wind up putting in the selected student as a piece of optional information. So go ahead and modify line 1 to have in quotes and curly braces, selected student, semicolon. And then do Control F5 and run the page again. Capstone students, look up, I'll look up the 30 again, get student information. Selected student equal 30. Didn't quite go like what I thought. Well, let's see. If I change this to a post, see what happens now. Yeah, there should be, oh, did I say semicolon? I meant to say question mark. So the selected student should be an optional thing. Well, actually, but I will. No, you know what? I won't change it from a get to a post. What I will do is I'll do this on my selected student. I'm going to put an attribute on it called a bind property, but I'm going to have an extra piece of information in here where I set supports get equal to true. So let me just separate those by a line there. Let me just try this out before I go and give any more directions to you guys. It's still doing it with the question mark. I'll have to think about how I'm going to do this. Let me try it with a post. Now, Control F5, capstone students. Okay, I got a whole bunch of things that are happening. As soon as I went and did a post, I had a bit of a problem with my all students. Let me go and try to build out the full thing that I'm going to want to have. I'm going to create a public void on post. And I'm going to do that same populating. I'll just copy the code for right now. Let me scroll this up a little bit. And I'll give you time to finish copying that stuff down in a bit. That lookup student also keeps getting filled with a 0 in there. So I'm going to, okay, so I've got the post happening. That's nice. I think I'm going to want to do something else. I think I'm going to want to, maybe what I'll actually do, I'll comment that out, and I will do something different with this. So I'm going to return redirect to page or the current page with a route value. So I'll use an anonymous type that I'll say is selected student. You can do it just like that. Do a Control F5. Capstone students. I'll look up recline. That's better. That's what I wanted. Now I've got something that is of interest here. And I'll add a little bit of information. There you go. Bring that up a little bit like that. And I'll just throw a little paragraph underneath, looking up information for student. And I will have, and you know what? I'm going to change this to an int question mark. That's the last thing I'm going to do here. Make that an int question mark. That's why I was getting that 0. Looking up information for student ID, and then I'll put it in quotes, and I will put at model dot selected student. There. Okay, make those particular changes. So here's the moving parts in everything. We've got a bind property, supports get. You can do that in an orange outline, not red, because it's a good thing, not a bad thing. We've got our on post. It's doing something a little different. It's got an I action result, whatever that is. And I've got this selected student, which is my routing. So that's to give you an idea about what that is all about. This here is my page directive with an optional page routing parameter. So I can put routing parameters on there. That's what that selected student in curly braces is. This here is a bind property. It's a bound property for the input control that also does binding for get requests. And this here is an example of what's called a post redirect get pattern, where after the post occurs, it sends a 307 status code to the browser, which tells the browser to do a get request. And then the other added thing that I'm doing is I'm just doing a little bit of echoing out of the information so that you can see that selected student number on there. So let me do a little screen grab. And give me a thumbs up when you have this coded and working on your machine in your browser. And I'll shrink that a little bit. Bring up the developer tools so I can see the network tab. And I'll show you what winds up happening with this when I do the request. So I've got about 5 people working on that coding, or that have done that coding, 6. So we actually have gone a good bit of distance in today's class. I think I won't go beyond what I've done right now. What we'll do is in our Wednesday class, we'll finish the CRUD operations. We'll actually show the details of the student that we do a lookup for. And then what we'll do is we will add in some other buttons that will allow us to do the insert, update, and delete. We'll make this page a little bit more functional for us. Got about 6 people done getting that coding. By the way, if you're running into any problems, you can mention those in the chat, because there's going to be at least 6 people there who'll be able to help you. Okay, let's go and see that error message. So you couldn't find a constructor that could give you the things that you wanted in your capstone students model. So that is a matter of making sure that you've got the right constructor information for the capstone students model. So here's that part, that first part. Make sure that you got those done right. And then if that still doesn't do it, then the problem lies in your startup extension, because your startup extension should have this line for the backup dependencies that adds in your transient. So startup extension should have the thing to add your backup dependencies to get the capstone service object. And you have both of those things. So then the capstone service has its own constructor and dependencies. Let me pop that up there. I'll put everything on the same one so I can get some better ones. So the capstone service has its own constructor and dependencies as well. Capstone service needs the database. And the page needs the capstone service. And getting those access modifiers correct, internal versus public, those will all make big differences. So for the capstone services, my using statements, basically the only ones I really need to have in here are the ones for the backend DAL and entities, as well as the system namespaces for link, generic collections, and the regular system types. Notice I don't have a using statement for the models because I'm using an explicit or fully qualified name for the student name and the student classes under backend models. I wanted to avoid a namespace collision. So under the capstone service, list capstone students, not all code paths return a value. So that means you need to remember to return your results. And student name does not contain a definition for student ID and no accessible extension method student ID accepting a first argument of student name can be found. So student name, and that's happening in your managed capstone students, probably your managed capstone students.cshtml. And that's a matter of making sure that when you did your student name, that you called that parameter student ID. So on that object, that's the property name that you're going to wind up having. It's being referenced inside of, let me go up here, inside of this right here. Yeah, spelling errors, that'll do it. Okay, well, let me show you. I'll stick around and I'll help with debugging a couple of other things, but let me show you what's happening in your page when you wind up going and doing this. And by the way, let me clear that out. And let me do the DA, choose Wanda Davis. Let's watch what happens when I click on this for the get student information. What wound up happening is, and ignore this WebSocket one, this is about doing browser refresh. But what wound up happening is when I clicked this button, it went and sent the request for the managed capstone students to the web server, and the web server responded. I said it was going to respond with a 307. My mistake. It's a 302. 307 is a permanent redirect. 302 is a temporary redirect. So it got a 302 response, which told the browser to request, do a get request of this page, 34 on the managed capstone students. And when we did that get request, it came back with a 200. So here we wound up doing a post that responded with a 302, and then the browser in turn did a GET request for that particular page. So that's the cycle that went on. The browser wound up making 2 calls after I clicked the button. First one with a post. Response came back that told us to do a second one with a GET. We'll be seeing more of the post redirect GET in Wednesday's class. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you for watching, and I'll stick around for a few more minutes and answer people's questions and see what's going on for your particular errors. See you next time.